Hi, my name is Ben Hales and this is the fifth part of an exclusive video series for TournamentPokerEdge.com. In this part, I'm going to be continuing to look at Hold'em Manager 2 reports and filters. I finished off last time looking at the position report, one of my personal favourites. The next one in the list of reports is races. Races is not a report which I use very often. It does have some value for tournament players. It provides you with a list of how often you are winning races and compares it to the expected outcomes. In effect, it tells you if you're running hot or cold on those big all-in hands. If you're having a rough trot, you can come here, select a relevant date range and check your overall average all-in EV percentage. It is broken down by the likelihood of you winning. You might not be able to see this very clearly on the left hand side. If you ever cannot see something in a field, you can alter the width of columns by dragging across like this, and also with the rows. So for example here, you can make the rows look bigger. As you can see on the list here, my races won percentage is 53% and I should have won 52.4%. So overall I'm running slightly hot on my races. If I change the date range and select a small date range, say yesterday, then the discrepancy between these two figures might be quite large. As it happens, it's still fairly the same here. Yesterday I should have won 49% and I actually came in a little bit below at 46%. Generally speaking, you want your average all-in EV percentage to be just above 50%. If it is below, then you've been going in from behind too often. But ideal numbers will vary depending on the type of poker that you play. Aggressive turbo players, for instance, might find this number is less than 50% but are compensating for it by the amount they are winning in uncontested pots. If there is an important number on this report though, this is it. Your net won and also your EV adjusted net won figures can get distorted for multi-tournament players by huge hands. So I would stick to the all-in EV percentage that I'm hovering over here to judge your overall performance. Long term, if you play enough poker, as you can see on my stats, if I open up the date range again, the expected value numbers won't really differ from the actual 1% percentage and net won numbers. Across all the columns you can see they're pretty much the same. Of much more interest to me is the following report, stack size. Like the position report, this report is very useful for finding where a player's strengths and weaknesses lie. Remember, from the previous video I advised you as a tournament player to judge your performance by big blinds won per 100 hands. As you can see from my results, I'm making a healthy profit in deep stack situations, falling gradually as we get to that yellow zone. I struggle to make much money at 11 to 15 big blinds, but my push fold game is sound with a reasonable return there. So I could use this report as the starting point for driving improvements to my game. If you fail to see the stack sizes here, you can drag the column width like this, and that allows you to view anything in fields where something might become obscured. Similarly with the rows, you can alter the width of the rows like this. Just left click and drag. By the way, I'd like to also mention at this point that the data for a lot of these reports, not all of them, but a lot of them, is available in graph format. Where it is, you'll see the graph tab on the right hand side, and if I click on this now, you can see the big blinds won per 100 hands plotted against stack size in a line graph format. You can change the data over on the left hand side here with the VPIP, and for example pre-flop raise, you can add in as many as you want here, and You can see you can build up some nice looking graphs as well as line graphs. If you use the drop down arrow here, you can change that to bar graphs or pie charts, and there you go. I'm a numbers man myself. I prefer my data in tabulated format, but the graphs do contain the same information. It's really all about personal preferences. Now let's get back to how we might use this report. Let's look at this 11 to 15 big blind stack size range. I'm only making a small profit with this stack size. Perhaps I'm doing something wrong. How could I go about finding out that information? Well, there are many things I could do within Hold'em Manager 2. Let's find out if there are certain hands which are causing me a problem. To do this, I'm going to use what is known as the whole cards grid. First, I make sure I'm highlighting the 11 to 15 big blinds. So make sure it's on this particular row. That means that we're only looking at the data from the 70,463 hands in this row. The information at the bottom of the screen in the hands section now adjusts to the 70,000 hands that I'm highlighting. This button here is the show or hide whole cards grid button. I'm going to click on this now. It's the 16 square multicolored cube, and a pop-up window comes up. Let me just centralize that for you. In this window I can see some very interesting and useful information about how well I'm performing with each different hand at 11 to 15 big blinds. Immediately I can see I am overplaying ace 2 and ace 3 offsuit. If I hover over them, I can see exactly how many big blinds I've lost whilst playing them, and I'm not impressed. Queen 10 offsuit, Jack 9 offsuit are also standout hands where I'm losing too much money. There's a few hands here that I'm clearly overplaying at 11 to 15 big blinds. If you do a similar search of your own hands, you'll no doubt discover your own weak areas. Sometimes our perceptions of how strong certain hands are is slightly inaccurate, and using this type of data can help us to put these things right. If I wanted to examine in further detail what I am doing with ace 2 offsuit, for example, I could add an appropriate filter by clicking on the More Filters button here. The third submenu in the Filters pop-up window is all about Hold'em whole cards, and the fourth one is Omaha whole cards. Thankfully, the Hold'em one is pretty straightforward, as you can see here. When there are no filters on, all cards are selected. We can deselect them all by clicking the Select None button here. If you want to turn on particular groups of cards, you can do so using the buttons on the right hand side like this. You can also just manually click on any particular card on the grid and turn it on and on with the left click button here, on and off. I want the ace 2 offsuit button, so I'm going to apply that here. I can see in the top right hand corner that it is indeed applied, so now I click on OK, and the report will now load, filtering for hands where I'm just playing ace 2 offsuit. And clearly I have a leak here which extends beyond just the 11 to 15 big blinds which I originally intended to look at. I can make a mental note now to examine this in more detail later. But let's continue looking at these 667 hands in the 11 to 15 big blind category. 600 hands is a few too many to start examining on a hand-to-hand basis. I haven't got all day. To narrow it down further, I could filter by position on the table, by my pre-flop action perhaps, or I could narrow down further on the stack size. All of these would be good ways to reduce the number of hands to look at. Another one I like looking at is the bust out hands filter. I don't like the thought of busting out of tournaments with ace 2 offsuit at 11 to 15 big blinds if I'm not playing heads up. So what I could do is go back now to the filters window, just centralize that once again. In the tournament filters submenu, there's the bust out hands filter here, and if I apply that, oops, I forgot to do something. Do you know what I forgot to do? Something that you must do every time, and when you're playing around with this is something you're bound to do. After you select, always remember the green plus arrow and check that it's applied in the right hand box here, and now it should work. Okay, so now I've managed to narrow this down to just 19 examples, which suggests that my busting out is not the root of my problem. Perhaps the opposite is true. So I could of course now go through these hands to see what I've done wrong, or I could take off the bust out hands filter like this, use the red minus button, and choose a different filter. Filtering by preflop action is often a good idea. To do that, you go to the basic filters, and I could now choose preflop raise here. Another way of doing that is to go to the filter by actions submenu here, the 7th submenu. And as you can see, you've got different filters for the different streets. You've got preflop, flop, turn, and river. I want to filter by preflop action, so I tick this box and I want to see what happens when I raise. So I can choose raise or raise any and click on OK. You can see preflop action is R, and now reapply that to the report, and as you can see, there's no problem when I'm raising. Perhaps I'm sometimes just calling, so I could go back in now and change the preflop action, filter by actions, change it to call, and click on OK. And aha, so it looks like I have a problem here. I'm doing much better when I raise, so I should probably stick to raising or folding pre-flop. I could now choose to look at these 72 hands here, which appear at the bottom, and replay them all in the replayer like this. See what I'm doing wrong in these hands. You can see that the more you get involved with these reports and filters, the more self-coaching you can do, organizing groups of hands for analysis in this manner. Let's now move on and look at the next report, which is called the Tournament Ante Report. This is not a report you're likely to spend long with, but it does contain some very specific data. It divides up your performance by hands pre-antes and hands with antes. Some players, especially turbo players, will need to ensure that they are fully in tune with the pace of the tournament and playing super aggressively once antes are introduced. If you see your big blinds per 100 hands is in green for pre-antes but in red for with antes, you know you've got a problem adjusting to the slightly different structure. The reverse might also be true, but it is less likely, and by the way, more serious a problem. If you do notice a problem on this report, you should combine your analysis with the stack sizes report, which also highlights issues with understanding the pace of tournaments. We often talk about having to change gears to adjust to increasing blind sizes. If you're failing to manage this, then these two reports will highlight this. As you can see from my report, I'm finding a reasonable balance when there are antes involved. I'm actually only winning dollars at Showdown 47.6% of the time, but I'm stealing successfully often enough to offset those losses and to make an overall profit of 1.26 big blinds per 100 hands. Not brilliant, but I only play with antes in the very late stages of tournaments, so it's hard to make much profit then. Once again though, the big blinds per 100 hands is the key figure. If you really like looking at net chips won, I recommend that you add in the adjusted value statistic. To do this and take away that luck factor, I just centralize the select report statistics box, which of course you can bring up by clicking on the stats on the left hand side. In the middle menus at the bottom there's an all-in equity here, and then the first one is US dollars EV adjusted, and if we move that across and position it with the orange arrows next to the net one, this figure should give you, once that loads up, it's taking a little bit of time to load, but it will give, on mine it should be roughly the same as the net one, but depends on how much data you've got in. And there you can see my net one with antes in. Actually, I've been a little bit unlucky. I've actually won 82,000 and I should have won 253,000. I want to do something similar now on the stack size report. This time I want to add the expected value big blinds per 100 hands stat. Sounds complicated, and it kind of is, but this one's really well worth paying attention to. To add it, I click on stats, bring up the select report statistics menu, and I find the all-in equity menu. It's right down the bottom here, so you'll need to use the scroll bar in the middle. And what this does is it filters out most of the statistics, so you've just got a few, and in there's this one, the expected value big blinds won per 100 hands. Add with the orange arrow, position where you want it. I suggest next to your actual big blinds won per 100 hands, and click on OK. So we can now compare these two columns to see if there are any discrepancies. This stat is arguably the most important of all performance monitoring stats for tournament players. It tells you what you ought to have won with the luck factor adjusted for all-in situations. And when you're dealing with small sample sizes, it's the nearest thing you can get to a reliable measure. For large sample sizes, it's probably unnecessary. Indeed, if you look at my overall big blinds won per 100 hands and my expected value big blinds won per 100 hands, there's no real difference in these two figures. But for the smaller sample sizes on some of the breakdowns by stack size, there are discrepancies. The tournament results report looks like this. I've not played seriously on PokerStars this year, so I've chosen this year as a date range to keep my overall winnings data private. If you want to know more, you can always sharkscope me. This report lists the tournaments you've played in, grouped by tournament type. Hold'em Manager 2 automatically tags a tournament, and you can see the tag count column shows you how many of each particular tournament type you have played. This is useful if you play lots of different types of tournaments and you want to see how profitable you are at each one. You can also see your in the money percentage, your ROI, and a breakdown of the various finishing positions. These types of stats look good on graphs too, so don't forget you can use them. Remember though that variance in multi-table tournaments is massive, whereas variance on single-table tournaments is relatively small. In single-table games, you need only about 300 or 400 games of data before your ROI figure is a reasonable accurate measurement of your performance, whereas in multi-tournament games, even 3,000 or 4,000 games may not be enough. For that reason, I recommend you use this report guardedly until you have vast amounts of data. As a player, I understand the importance of looking at results-based data, but as a coach, I'm much more interested in how to fix problems. So my advice is, use this report, but don't spend too long with it. There's a you can press at any time to get similar data, which is the tournament summary button or the trophy icon located here, which I'm going to click now. As you can see, this tells me my ROI and in the money stats as well as my hourly rate. I can click on the EV adjusted box to see my luck adjusted figures, and I can see a nice breakdown of my finished positions in the graph at the bottom. The data it returns is based on the date range filter only. It doesn't matter what you have highlighted in the reports section. The tournament stack size report doesn't really differ much from the stack size report. The only difference I would see really is the way that the data is divided up. I see only one benefit in this report, and that is the micro stack size of 1 to 5 big blinds. If you have a weakness in your push fold game, you can see perhaps whether it lies in the 1 to 5 or in the 6 to 10 or both sections. I'm fairly happy with mine, but if you highlight a weakness, you can start analysing it further using the filters. For example, if this figure were in red, you might either be folding too often from the blinds, missing opportunities to call with positive expectation, or missing opportunities to push all in. These are common mistakes, as players tend to stare at certain cards and auto fold. But actually, when you're very low stacked, it can be sometimes necessary to gamble with poor hold cards. Let's try filtering for when you're sat on the big blind facing a razor and you choose to fold connected low cards. To do this, I need to go to the More Filters section. I'm going to choose Basic Filters and select my position as the big blind by deselecting or unchecking these boxes. I then look at the pre-flop action facing the hero and do a similar thing, so I'm unchecking the options where there's no razor. I want to be facing a razor, and I've chosen not to see a flop, so I've folded. You can do that, of course, in the actions by choosing fold. I'm choosing to keep it all within the basic filters and use this window here. It does exactly the same thing. I then want to choose some hold cards. They're all selected, so I'm going to select none, and now I'm just simply going to choose ones which I want to look at. So let's choose some of these gapped and double gapped unsuited connected hands. That'll do, and see how many that returns. So in this micro stack of 1 to 5 big blinds, you can see I've pulled out 47 hands of this type. Sat on the big blind, I've chosen to fold. Maybe there was some value in perhaps choosing to gamble with some of these hands, and you know what you could do is now run off these hands on the replayer, replay all these hands and analyze them. So in fact, let's do it quickly. So if we replay all, bring up the replayer, first one here, 6-4 offsuit, button pushes all in, and okay, I think I'm only going to win about maybe a third of the time against his range of hands, so that's not great equity. It's not enough to justify calling. It's 585 chips to win 810. I'd need to be able to win nearly 1,200 chips to justify calling here if my equity calculation's correct. So a fold is going to be a good option. I could go through all these hands doing equity and EV calculations, which in itself is a fantastic way of learning poker. If you struggle with these kind of calculations, let me know. I'd be happy to do a video on it. I know that I'll be getting most of these decisions right, but are you? If not, that's a leak in your game, and that can be fixed by teaching you the right thought process. The next report is the tournament stats report. This breaks down your tournaments by day, and it's definitely a favourite report of results orientated people. Again, I'm filtering for just this year. If you're playing regularly, you'll probably want to do this by week or by month. Checking short-term ROI in the money percentages or finish positions or winnings might have some psychological benefits, but these stats are only really of interest to me as part of longer-term objectives. I want to look at the results of hundreds or thousands of games, not 20 or 30. So for me, the most interesting thing here is the bottom row. And this is available in the tournament results report anyway. Having said that, there are important points about keeping a track of your own performance. And for those of you who don't keep your own personal spreadsheets as well, bobbing in here and just checking your daily performance does of course have benefit from an organizational point of view. The next report, the tournament report, is on the other hand a very useful report. This is where you come to review specific hand histories. As a coach, I'm using this daily. Once again, you're going to want to use the date range filter to narrow down your search for a particular tournament. Frequently, I'll choose the last week date range filter when looking at my students' performance over the past week. Then, I can select a tournament I wish to review, or my student can easily find the one he or she wants to look at. If I single click on a tournament, it simply highlights it. If I double click on it, it opens up the tournament editor window where you can manually adjust stats if Hold'em Manager has corrupt or incomplete data. This does happen, especially if your Hold'em Manager crashes whilst you are playing. If you're serious about using this tool, you should make an effort to keep it clean and error-free. If I click on the finish position column here, the data is sorted by finish position. This works for all the reports, of course. You can sort and order the data by any of the columns, and if you add additional stats, you can sort by those too. Now that I've ordered by finish positions, you can see that there are no instances of the finish position being 0. If you see in your report any instances of the finish position being 0, you know you have an incomplete tournament, and you should request the hand history from the relevant poker site and manually complete the edit tournament box. It might never be necessary, but if your Hold'em Manager crashes whilst you're playing, make sure you go through this tedious process, otherwise your database will be corrupted. The things to adjust are your tournament finish position and your winnings, which are the two bottom boxes. If you now look down at the bottom of the screen and the list of hands, you'll notice that by default, Hold'em Manager displays the last 250 relevant hands. You can also select the last 1000 or all if necessary. Sometimes a tournament has more than 250 hands. If you want to view them in all, you must remember to click the last 1000 circle here. When you view Hold'em Manager 2 in full screen, you can make each section much bigger, which allows for better viewing. But for the purposes of this video, I'm now going to adjust the size of the bottom section by dragging it up, covering some of the report section, like this. If you want to review a whole tournament, be aware that for obvious reasons, Hold'em Manager orders hands by the most recently played. But for reviewing a tournament, we will usually want the opposite. We want to see the oldest hand first, or the first hand in the tournament. So in the top section, once you've highlighted the tournament that you want to review, and you can see all the hands at the bottom, you should then click on the time column once, only once. That orders the hands from first to last, and you can now right click on any hand like this and replay all. Inside the replayer, it should then start at hand 1 and go through to the end of the tournament, and you can replay here. If you are searching for one specific hand from a tournament, you can do that in several different ways. You might know it was halfway through and it was ace ace, and you can simply scroll down using your wheel on the mouse or using the scroll bar on the right hand side here, and simply locate it that way. You can do it inside the replayer as well, just by replaying the hands through until you see it. It could well be the last hand where you busted out of the tournament. That's always easy to find, as it's simply the last one. But it might just be a big hand where you've won or lost a lot of chips, but you can't remember what cards you had or exactly when it was. You can order the hands by chips won. So simply clicking on the chips column at the top here will order the hands by the number of chips that you've won or lost, as in the case here, the 891 chips lost, and you can look at hands like that. That's I find a very useful way of ordering information. It might not be a big hand that you're looking for. It could be an innocuous hand where there's very little to define what it was. Maybe you folded it pre-flop, but you weren't sure what to do, and you really wanted to review it. This can be more difficult to find. The best way to remember hands is to mark them whilst you are playing, and I'm going to discuss how to mark hands in the 7th part of this video series. In fact, I want to say a lot more about this hands section, but for now let's return to the reports and look at the next one on the list, the versus player report, which is this one. Whilst that's loading, I'm just going to drag the hands back down a little bit so you've got a better view of the report itself. The first thing I should say about this report is that it's not the fastest to run, especially if you've got a lot of data. If you don't have a lot of data, it's fairly meaningless. It's just taken me about 5 minutes to load up my entire database onto this report. The reason it takes such a long time is it is providing you with information about all of the players in your database on one report. It's entirely understandable, but it might be one way you want to go and put the kettle on and come back 5 minutes later. I think the report is a lot of fun, especially if you play against opponents that you know. For higher stakes players, it may well also be a serious report, though you might want to check out, for example, how well you're performing against certain regulars. I'm not convinced, though, that it provides much additional information that cannot be obtained from the main Opponents tab at the top of Hold'em Manager 2 here. The information it does supply is how many hands you've won and lost against that player, any huge ones, any big stack wins, and of course then at the end your list of net dollars won against that player. I for one am enjoying seeing my friend enter Benny, who is a very good player, 4th on my list of net chips won. The problem, of course, with using this data for anything is that, as always, when you're looking at just a handful of hands, probably huge heads-up hands, the amount of variance in the data is massive, and even in my database of 600,000 hands, this report means next to nothing. If I wanted to annoy my friend, though, I could click on his name here, list all of the hands that we've played together at the bottom on the report here, pick out some juicy ones where I've perhaps won a lot of chips. We could search by chips won, for example, like this, and perhaps post one to his Facebook page or send him an email for a bit of fun. Well, I hope you've picked up some useful tips in this fifth part of my Hold'em Manager 2 video series. I'm going to continue next time with the winning summary report, which is a useful addition to the two stack sizes reports we looked at today. My name is Ben Hales, and my details are listed at tournamentpokeredge.com. Thank you for watching.